I am Madison, 32 years old, and last week my aunt stood up at my cousin's rehearsal dinner and told 80 guests I wasn't her real daughter. She said it with a smile, in front of everyone, while announcing she was paying for the $150,000 wedding with money I'd secretly been giving them for 10 years. The whole room turned to look at me. I could feel their pity, their whispers, the weight of public humiliation pressing down on my chest. And then I smiled back, because I knew something they didn't. Have you ever felt like the invisible one in your own family? Let me know your story down in the comments. Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I'd love to know who's part of our community. The air on the luxury yacht was thick with the scent of expensive lilies and the salt spray of Martha's Vineyard. My Aunt Stephanie stood at the head of the long mahogany table, her silk dress shimmering under the crystal chandeliers like oil on water. She looked perfect, the picture of old money elegance, as she raised her crystal flute to the 80 guests, who represented the peak of the island's social hierarchy. I sat there, the 32-year-old litigation lawyer who had spent a decade being the family's silent safety net, and watched her lips curl into that practiced, lethal smile. When she called me a parasite and an outsider in front of everyone, I didn't feel my heart break. I felt it solidify. Anger wasn't loud this time, it was clinical. I placed my glass down on the white tablecloth. The sound of crystal meeting wood was the only noise in my head, as the whispers started. I didn't cry. I didn't ask. I didn't ask why. I didn't give them the satisfaction of a scene. Instead, I stood up with a calm that seemed to unnerve my Uncle Kenneth, who sat beside Stephanie, refusing to meet my eyes. I walked out to the deck. The Atlantic wind was cold, sharp, and honest, a welcome contrast to the gilded lies inside the cabin. I reached into my clutch and pulled out my phone. My hands were steady, my movements as precise as they were when I was filing a motion in Superior Court. I opened my banking app. It was 11:57 in the evening. I stared at the Sterling Family Trust entry on my screen, the black hole that had swallowed $5,000 of my salary every single month for 10 years. I clicked Cancel Recurring Transfer. Then I clicked Confirm. I didn't feel regret. I felt like I was finally auditing a bad investment. For a decade, I'd been the silent investor in their version of family, footing the bill for a lifestyle they hadn't earned. Now, I realized it had been a subscription service, and the trial period was officially over. I opened our family group chat. Stephanie, Kenneth, and my cousin Grace were all there. Grace, the princess whose $150,000 wedding was currently being fueled by my sweat and overtime hours. I typed 5 words. The kindness subscription has expired. I hit send and watched the little grey bubbles appear. I didn't wait for them to turn blue. I blocked them all. Inside, I could hear the muffled sound of the orchestra playing a celebratory waltz. They were still in there, celebrating a future they thought I was paying for. I leaned against the railing, looking out at the dark horizon of Martha's Vineyard. This wasn't a breakdown. It was a balance sheet. My compassion had been a luxury they'd overdrafted for years, and tonight, I was declaring emotional bankruptcy on their behalf. I checked my watch. It was 12:03 in the morning. In 6 minutes, I had dismantled a decade of servitude. I looked back at the glass doors of the yacht. My Aunt Stephanie's face was visible through the window. She was looking at her phone. I saw the moment her expression went from triumphant to white, drained of every drop of old money composure. I didn't wait for her to come out and plead. I didn't wait for the inevitable gaslighting. I walked to the stern, called a water taxi, and prepared to step onto a different shore, one where I didn't have to buy my right to exist. $650,000. I sat in the back of the water taxi, the engine's low hum vibrating through the floorboards, and let that number settle in my bones. It wasn't just a figure on a screen anymore. It was a decade of my life, distilled into cold, hard currency. Over the last 10 years, I had transferred exactly $650,000 into the Sterling Family Trust. That was more than the cost of a luxury condo in downtown Boston. It was more than some people made in an entire lifetime. And yet, to my Aunt Stephanie and Uncle Kenneth, It was just the rent I paid for the privilege of being tolerated. 10 years ago, I was 22, standing in the rain at my parents' funeral, clutching a damp tissue and feeling like the world had dissolved beneath my feet. My parents were gone, and according to Stephanie, they had left behind a mountain of shameful debt. She took me aside that night, her voice a hushed, manipulative whisper, and told me that the family estate was in ruins. She told me that she and Kenneth were sacrificing their own stability to keep my parents' names out of the bankruptcy courts. Back then, I believed her. I was grieving, vulnerable, and desperate for a sense of belonging. When she told me I owed it to the family to help pay off those debts, I didn't question it. I thanked her. I thanked her for the opportunity to work my fingers to the bone, to pay back a debt that, as I would eventually learn, never actually existed. That was the beginning of my life as the family's silent investor. I moved to Boston, landed a junior associate position at a litigation firm, and started the cycle. I lived in a high-rise studio in the Seaport District, a glass box in the sky that was expensive, modern, and utterly hollow. It was a residence meant for a successful lawyer, but it never felt like a home. While I wore designer suits that functioned as armor in the courtroom, my apartment remained a void. There were no photos on the walls, no rugs on the cold hardwood floors, just a designer desk covered in legal briefs and a single espresso machine. I kept wondering, late at night, while I stared at the sterile, white ceiling of my expensive cage, what I had ever done wrong. Why was my life a series of sacrifices, while my cousin Grace's life was a parade of celebrations? Grace was 4 years younger, the golden child who never had to learn the value of a dollar because she was always spending mine. While I was pulling 80-hour weeks to make partner, Grace was posting photos from villas in Tuscany and shopping sprees on Fifth Avenue. I remember seeing one post in particular. It was 3 years ago. Grace was holding a designer handbag that cost $4,000, the exact amount of the emergency medical bill Stephanie had begged me to cover that same month. Grace's caption was, "Blessed to have parents who spoil me." I looked at that photo in my cold, dark apartment, and for a second, the invisible chains tightened around my throat. But I stayed silent. I stayed useful. My therapist would later call this a fawn response. It was an invisible chain I had forged for myself. In a toxic environment, the survivor often learns that the only way to stay safe is to be indispensable. I wasn't buying their love. I was buying a temporary reprieve from their rejection. I lived in a house of cards, a prison without bars, where the walls were built from my own guilt, and the ceiling was held up by Stephanie's constant reminders of how lucky I was that they hadn't left me on the street. I used to think that being needed was the same as being wanted. I thought that if I gave enough, if I paid enough, if I became the ultimate safety net, they would finally see me as a real daughter. I was wrong. To Stephanie and Kenneth, my worth was tied entirely to my utility. I wasn't Madison, their niece. I was a recurring revenue stream. The contrast between our lives was a study in cruelty. While I was calculating whether I could afford a new winter coat, they were using my money to upgrade the granite countertops in their Martha's Vineyard house. While I was skipping dental appointments to save a few $100s, Grace was getting a $150,000 wedding. I looked down at my hands in the dim light of the water taxi. They were still steady. For 10 years, I had been the invisible foundation of their social standing. I had been the silent investor in their lie of old money elegance. But tonight, on that luxury yacht, the foundation had finally cracked. Stephanie's smile had been the final blow, the sharp edge that cut through the last of those invisible chains. She had stood there, wearing a dress that probably cost 3 months of my transfers, and called me an outsider. She had used my own sacrifice as a weapon to humiliate me. She thought I was still that grieving 22-year-old girl who would do anything to be loved. She didn't realize she was talking to a litigation lawyer who spent her days dismantling people far more powerful than a bitter aunt on a borrowed yacht. As the water taxi pulled toward the harbor, I realized that my silence hadn't been a virtue. It had been my cage. And tonight, I didn't just walk out of the party. I walked out of the role they had assigned me. I wasn't their cash cow anymore. I wasn't their burden. I was the person holding the receipts for 10 years of deception. The Atlantic air was freezing now, but I didn't pull my coat tighter. I wanted to feel the cold. I wanted it to burn away the last decade of compliance. My compassion had been a resource they had overdrafted, until the account was dry. I was done being a martyr. I was ready to be an accountant. And the audit of the Sterling family was just beginning. The morning sun over the harbour didn't bring warmth, just exposure. I sat on the balcony of my hotel, watching the fog lift from the water, while my phone performed a frantic, vibrating dance on the glass table. 52 missed calls from Stephanie, 17 from Kenneth, dozens of texts that evolved from confusion to clinical rage. I didn't answer a single one. I went back to my laptop. Anger wasn't loud this time. It was clinical. I watched as Stephanie launched the first strike of her escalation. She had posted a photo on Instagram, a black and white image of herself and Grace, looking devastated. The caption was a masterpiece of gaslighting. Heartbroken that some people choose money over family. Grace's special day is being sabotaged by greed. Please pray for our family during this trial. I stared at the screen, a small, cold smile touching my lips. She wasn't shocked by what she had done. She was shocked that I had stopped playing along. In the comments, the Martha's Vineyard social circle was already circling. So sorry, Stephanie, one wrote. Some people forget who raised them, said another. I could practically smell the desperation through the screen, a scent more pungent than the salt air. Stephanie knew the vendors for the $150,000 wedding were expecting their final checks by the end of the week. Without my $5,000 monthly transfer, the old money facade was about to hit the brick wall of reality. I reached for my phone, but not to call her. I called Marcus Webb, the family's financial advisor. His voice was strained when he answered. Madison, your aunt is claiming there's a technical glitch with your automated deposits. She's demanding I manually override the system to push the wedding payments through. That's not going to happen, Marcus, I said, my voice steady and factual. In fact, I'm shifting this from a family dispute to a professional audit. I've already contacted a forensic accountant in Boston. I need a line-by-line breakdown of every cent I've sent into that trust over the last 10 years. Madison, she's family, Marcus started. But I cut him off. No, Marcus. She's a client who has overextended her credit. My compassion was a luxury. She's overdrafted for a decade, and now I'm calling in the debt. I ended the call and drafted a formal notice of accounting. I didn't use the language of a hurt niece. I used the language of a litigation lawyer. I sent a single email to Stephanie, CCing my firm's senior partner. The message was brief. You have 72 hours to provide a certified accounting of the $650,000 I have contributed to the Sterling Family Trust. Any failure to document these funds as were paid parent debt will result in an immediate filing for breach of fiduciary duty and fraud. I hit send. Inside, my laptop glowed with a different kind of sunrise, the kind made of facts, numbers, and quiet retribution. This wasn't a breakdown. It was an audit of her soul, and I knew exactly how many red lines I was about to find. The truth didn't arrive with a bang. It arrived in a dry, 50-page PDF from a forensic accounting firm. I sat in my office in Boston, the city's skyline blurred by the rain against my window, and watched as the last decade of my life was reclassified from sacrifice to fraud. I had spent 10 years paying for a ghost. My Aunt Stephanie had told me my parents died in a mountain of debt. She had used that shameful legacy to turn me into a financial slave. But as I scrolled through the bank records and the probate filings from 10 years ago, the numbers told a different story. A story of a calculated criminal heist. My parents hadn't been in debt. They had been careful. The auditor flagged a specific transaction from 2 weeks after the funeral. It was a payout from a life insurance policy. $1 million. The beneficiary listed was Madison Sterling. Me. I stared at the digital scan of the claim form. There, at the bottom, was a signature that looked like mine. But the slant was wrong. The pressure too heavy. It was a forgery. Stephanie and Kenneth hadn't just drained my current earnings, they had stolen my past. They had intercepted $1 million meant for my education and my future, and then they had the audacity to convince me I owed them for a roof over my head. Every cent I had transferred to them since I was 22 was pure profit for them. The family trust wasn't a safety net. It was a money laundering operation for my own stolen inheritance. They had used my $1 million to buy their house on Martha's Vineyard and fund Grace's private schools, then used my $5,000 monthly payments to maintain the lifestyle while they sat on my money. I rubbed my eyes, trying to summon regret, but there was only clarity. This wasn't a family dispute anymore. It was a crime scene. I realized that for 10 years, I hadn't been an unloved niece. I had been a victim of a long con. They hadn't just neglected me. They had systematically erased my identity to keep the cash flowing. I picked up the phone and called my firm's senior partner. "I need to file a criminal referral," I said, my voice as cold and factual as a balance sheet. "We're looking at forgery, identity theft, and grand larceny." I looked at the framed photo of my parents on my desk. For a decade, I thought I was paying off their failures. Now I knew I was the one holding the bill for their betrayal. The merciless hook they had used on me when I was 22 was finally being turned back on them. Calm, factual, lethal. The click of my Aunt Stephanie's designer heels on the marble floor of my law firm sounded like a death march. She didn't wait for my assistant to announce her. She burst into my office, her face a frantic mask of smudged mascara and desperation. The arrogance she'd displayed on the yacht at Martha's Vineyard was gone, replaced by the raw panic of a cornered animal. "Madison, you have to stop this," she gasped, her voice trembling as she clutched the edge of my mahogany desk. "The Harrison family, Brad's parents, they've heard about the audit. They're threatening to call off the wedding unless we prove the funds are legitimate." I didn't stand up. I didn't even look away from my monitor for the first 30 seconds. I let the silence stretch until she started to shake. When I finally turned my chair to face her, I didn't see an aunt. I saw a defendant. "The funds aren't legitimate, Stephanie," I said, my voice as level as a judge's gavel. "We both know that now." She tried to summon her old authority, pointing a shaky finger at me. "We raised you. We gave you a home when you had nothing. You owe Grace her fairy tale." I slid a single manila folder across the desk. Inside was the scan of the life insurance claim with the forged signature. "You didn't give me a home, Stephanie. You used $1 million of my stolen inheritance to buy yourself a life you couldn't afford." I watched the last of her old money composure evaporate. She collapsed into the chair, her breaths coming in ragged hitches. This was the illusion of power. I realized then that her entire social status had been a luxury suite she had rented, using my sweat and my parents' legacy. Without my $5,000 a month and the cushion of that stolen million, she was nothing more than a common thief in a silk dress. "Grace is innocent," she whispered, her eyes red and pleading. "Don't ruin her life because of a mistake we made years ago." "A mistake is a typo, Stephanie," I replied, leaning forward until I could see the sweat on her upper lip. "Forging my signature to steal $1 million and then gaslighting me for a decade to keep me paying your bills is a criminal enterprise." I stood up, adjusting my blazer. The power flip was complete. Brad's family is right to be concerned. A family that builds its reputation on fraud is not sophisticated. It's a liability. "What do you want?" she sobbed, looking smaller than I had ever imagined possible. "I've already given my statement to the district attorney," I said, my tone clinical and final. "The finisher is this. The Martha's Vineyard house is being seized as a proceeds of crime asset. You have 48 hours to vacate." I walked to the door and held it open. "Goodbye, Stephanie. Tell Grace I hope she finds a dress that doesn't cost someone else's soul." I didn't watch her leave. I went back to my desk, opened my laptop, and watched the different kind of sunrise, the one made of justice and the end of a 10-year debt. The wedding of the decade didn't end with a yes. It ended with a void. Within 24 hours of Stephanie leaving my office, the Harrison family issued a clinical statement. They weren't just cancelling the ceremony, they were performing a total social extraction. Grace was ghosted by her own fairy tale, left with a designer dress that was now just a white flag of surrender. Stephanie and Kenneth didn't fight the charges. The forensic audit was a burial shroud, leaving them no room to negotiate. They pleaded guilty to forgery and grand larceny to avoid a decade behind bars. The judgment was swift and irrevocable. They were ordered to pay full restitution, the $1 million from my parents' insurance, and the $650,000 I had transferred under duress during my decade as their silent investor. The estate in Martha's Vineyard was the first thing to go. I watched the auction online from my new office, seeing the place where I was once called an outsider sell for more than its stolen value. Stephanie and Kenneth moved to a modest mainland apartment, living on a fixed pension that barely covered their legal fees. Grace, the golden child who once bragged about being spoiled, had to find a job for the first time in her life, discovering that her luxury lifestyle was a debt she had never actually been the one to pay. I didn't take the money back to build a monument to my own pain. I kept only enough to pay off my student loans and secure a down payment for the life Daniel and I had been dreaming of. The rest, $1,300,000, went into the foundation I built from the ashes of their lies. I named it the Sterling Fund for Financial Autonomy. It's a safety net that actually works. We provide legal defense and forensic accounting for young people whose families treat them as human credit lines rather than human beings. It's my way of ensuring that no one else has to stay invisible for a decade just to avoid the cold of rejection. Last night, Daniel and I sat on the balcony of our new place, watching the city lights of Boston. He didn't ask me who I was living for anymore. He knew I was living for the woman who finally audited her own worth and found that the balance was higher than she ever imagined. The noise in my head, the echoes of Stephanie's gaslighting, and the constant need to be useful has finally been replaced by a silence that feels like peace. I used to think my place at the family table was something I had to pay for every month, like a subscription to a love that was never actually there. But here is what 10 years of being a silent investor finally taught me. Your place in a family should never require a payment plan. Your worth isn't measured by how much of yourself you're willing to burn away to keep others warm. For a decade, I lived in a house of cards, a prison without bars built from my own silence. I was the black sheep who exhausted herself trying to earn the title of real daughter, only to realize that the cage I was in was one I had the keys to the entire time. I didn't just break the silence, I broke the cycle. To those of you listening who feel invisible, who give until you are hollow, hear me. Setting boundaries isn't a betrayal, it is survival. Do not let your silence become the cage that keeps you small. It will hurt to walk away from people you love. But I promise you, staying in that silence will hurt much more. The Sterling family learned that they can't overdraft on my compassion anymore. And I learned that the best investment I ever made was finally choosing myself. If this story helped you find the courage to set your own boundaries, please share it. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss our next journey toward justice. Until next time, take care of yourself. You deserve it.